If you walk through that town today, the name is almost never spoken. The old house is gone, the land sold off, but the silence remains. Ask an old man in the diner, and he'll shift in his seat. He'll say he doesn't remember, or that it's not his place to tell. But the way his eyes dart to the corner, the way his voice lowers, those are confessions of their own. The story still lives there, not on paper, not in records, but in the marrow of memory. And when the family is spoken of, it's never directly. They call them the cursed ones, or that bloodline. The words aunt and nephew are never uttered. It's as though saying it aloud would grant it power again, as though the truth itself could rise from the grave. Yet, everyone knows. They see it in the graveyard, where too many small headstones cluster together. They see it in old photographs kept locked away in attics, where faces stare back with those same crooked eyes and unsettling smiles. What makes this story so unbearable is not just the sin, but the complicity. The way neighbors knew and chose silence. The way the church preached morality on Sunday, then turned away from the evidence in their pews. The way families in town warned their children privately, but never confronted the truth publicly. Silence in its own way became the second crime. It allowed the wound to fester, generation after generation, until the bloodline collapsed under its own weight. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken, even if it meant exile? Or would you have kept the silence, like everyone else? There's something deeply human about the fear of facing darkness in our own families, because to confront it is to admit that monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes they sit across from you at the dinner table. Sometimes, they tuck you into bed. And when the line between protector and predator blurs, the result is not just tragedy, it's a legacy of horror that seeps into the soil, staining everything it touches. The boy who slept with his aunt is gone. His children are gone. But the story remains. A caution, a curse, a whispered reminder that family secrets never stay buried. They live on, even when we refuse to speak them. There are stories that fade with time, worn away until they are nothing but rumor. But this one refuses to die. It lingers because it carries with it a universal dread, the knowledge that family, the place we are supposed to be safest, can also be the place where we are most destroyed. To know that a boy was led astray by the very woman who should have protected him is to stare into the abyss of betrayal itself. It twists love into corruption, care into control, and leaves behind nothing but ruin. Imagine the weight of growing up under such a shadow. Each generation born into suspicion, each child already judged before they could speak. No matter how innocent, they bore the curse written in their name. Teachers looked at them differently. Doctors examined them with questions unspoken. Even when one child managed to grow stronger, healthier, brighter, they could never fully escape the rumor clinging to their blood. To the outside world, they were never individuals. They were extensions of that one sin, doomed to repeat it. And in many ways, repeat it they did, not always in flesh, but in pattern. Isolation bred secrecy, secrecy bred shame, and shame created the conditions for more mistakes, more pain. Families trapped in silence often circle back to the same darkness. That is the true horror of inbreeding. Not only the deformities it carves into the body, but the psychological labyrinth it builds around the soul, a prison of shame so tight that no one dares break free. By the time outsiders pieced together the story, it was already too late. The original sinners were in the ground, and their children broken by the lives they never chose. What remained was a name spoken with pity, disgust, and fear, a lineage reduced to a cautionary tale. To this day, some locals swear they can feel it, the weight of that story, when they walk past the land where the family once lived, as if the soil itself remembers, as if the trees have absorbed the whispers of what was done there. And maybe that's the point. Some stories don't need books, or records, or monuments. Some stories live in the very air, warning anyone who listens. This one is a scar that belongs not only to a family, but to a community, a town, and maybe even to America itself. And so we arrive at the end of the story, though endings are never truly clean when it comes to secrets like these. The boy who slept with his aunt is dust now, the aunt herself long gone, their children buried under stones that speak no truth of what birthed them. Yet the silence, the shame, the memory, it all lingers like a stain that cannot be washed away. Some families pass down heirlooms, photographs, traditions. This family passed down a curse, a warning written in blood. What unsettles us most is not the grotesque details of their faces or the whispers of their deformities. What unsettles us is the realization that this could happen anywhere. Isolation, loneliness, silence. These are the conditions where darkness breeds. It does not take a castle or a throne. It only takes a home where shame is stronger than love, where silence is chosen over truth. That is how generations are destroyed. The story of the aunt and her nephew is not just about inbreeding, it is about betrayal. It is about how the ones we trust most can be the ones who lead us into ruin. And it is about the way entire communities participate, not by action, but by silence. Neighbors saw, the church knew, doctors suspected, yet no one spoke. And so the curse lived on, generation after generation, until the family's very name collapsed under the weight of what was done. Perhaps that is why these stories grip us so tightly. They remind us of the fragility of morality, of how quickly the line between right and wrong can blur when shame is stronger than truth. They remind us that the past does not stay buried, no matter how deep we dig. It bleeds through. It stares back from photographs, from gravestones, from the faces of children who never asked to carry the sins of their ancestors. The boy slept with his aunt. That is the bare, unflinching truth. And though their names are forgotten, their story soon revives, not because it deserves to be celebrated, but because it demands to be remembered. A reminder that family secrets, no matter how carefully buried, will claw their way to the surface. And when they do not just haunt the guilty, they haunt us all. They used to say she was born with her father's eyes, but in the town's silence, everyone knew those eyes did not belong to her father at all. They belonged to her uncle, the man she grew up calling husband. In the beginning, it seemed like a whispered rumor, a cruel joke traded between children in dusty schoolyards. But the older you get, the more you realize that in America's forgotten corners, sometimes the cruelest rumors are simply the truth nobody dares to speak out loud. She was the daughter of a family that had locked its doors too tightly, closing itself away from the world, from outsiders, from anyone who might stop what was happening inside. Her story is not just about one household, not just about one girl forced to blur the lines between uncle, father, and husband. It is about a lineage collapsing in on itself, folding under the weight of generations of secrecy. She carried their sins in her body, etched into her very features, reminders that could never be hidden. The town learned to look away. They always do. Poverty disguises a lot, and shame disguises even more. Her face was a haunting map of what happens when bloodlines are bent back upon themselves, her jaw never quite aligned, her speech slurred in ways that made classmates laugh, but adults turn their eyes to the floor. The cruel irony is that these features, the ones that made her stand out, were the same ones her family tried to pass off as just genetics. But genetics don't explain why she was seen holding her uncle's hand like a wife. Genetics don't explain why she called him husband. The story begins not with her, but with the soil she was born into, a patch of forgotten America where roads were cracked and names were carried like curses. Her birth was not a new beginning, it was the inevitable outcome of years of silence, control, and denial. To understand her, you have to understand the family that made her. A family that learned long ago that secrets rot slower when everyone agrees to pretend they aren't there. And so when she was born, she wasn't celebrated, she was pitied. A child brought into the world already burdened with her family's sins, already tied to a marriage she never asked for, already marked as the most inbred daughter. Her uncle, her so-called husband, was not a man of romance, nor tenderness. He was a man shaped by isolation, hardened by years of living in a house where no one questioned who belonged to whom. He had been raised under the same roof as her mother, the same blood flowing through his veins, the same patterns etched into his mind. By the time she was old enough to walk, he was already hovering near her, watching her like an heirloom he would one day inherit. The family called it protection. Neighbors called it strange, but truthfully, it was neither. It was ownership. A claim staked on her before she even understood what the word claim meant. And when she began to call him husband, the words didn't rise from love or choice. They were carved into her vocabulary by the silence of a family that wanted her compliance more than her freedom. Behind their doors, time warped. Days bled into each other in a suffocating cycle. Her uncle would sit at the table silent, his hands stained from farm work, his eyes never leaving her. Her mother avoided his gaze but never stopped him. It was as if the whole house was complicit, bound by an invisible agreement. Better to keep it quiet than to let the world know what we are. By adolescence, her life no longer belonged to her. She was paraded not as a child but as proof that their traditions were unbroken, though no tradition was ever spoken out loud. She became both daughter and wife, niece and possession. The contradictions tore at her body and mind. She laughed less. She spoke in shorter sentences. She looked perpetually tired, as if each day was heavier than the last. When she walked through town, people noticed. A tilt of the head, a whisper behind a hand. Everyone saw what was happening, but no one had the courage, or perhaps the cruelty, to say it out loud. They told themselves it was none of their business. That phrase, "how," has buried more American children than anyone will ever count. And so she endured year after year with her uncle's hand gripping hers, a grotesque parody of marriage. In photographs you can see her forced smile, the corners of her lips trembling as if her body knew the truth her words were not allowed to say. She wasn't his wife, she wasn't anyone's wife. She was a child, trapped in a nightmare dressed up as family. The roots of her story stretch far deeper than the walls of her childhood home. They reach back into generations of kin who had already blurred their own lines, who had already sown shame into the blood that carried forward. In families like hers, it begins quietly. An uncle who visits too often, a cousin who never marries outside the clan. People call it keeping things close, but closeness like that has a way of breeding darkness, of warping love into possession. Her grandfather was the true architect of this silence. A man who believed the world beyond his land had nothing to offer, who raised his children to mistrust outsiders, to stay within. What began as paranoia soon became doctrine. Daughters married brothers, cousins took cousins, and each generation folded back into the last. By the time she was born, it was no longer unusual to see a niece calling her uncle by another name. It had become the family's unspoken law. What happens to blood when it circles itself for too long? It changes, it deteriorates. Doctors and scientists have written about the consequences: fragile bones, twisted spines, cleft lips, minds that don't develop in time with their bodies. But no textbook can capture what it feels like to see it in the flesh. To see a child struggle to form words, to see their gaze drift in two directions at once, to hear laughter around them turn sharp and cruel. She carried those marks. She lived them. Still, her family refused to see tragedy. They saw only continuity, a closed loop guarded by silence and shame. To them, she wasn't a warning. She was a vessel, the next link in a chain they were too afraid or too proud to break. Her uncle's claim over her was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a bloodline that had been collapsing inward for decades. This is the part no one wants to face. These stories are not isolated. They happen in the hollows of Appalachia, in the forgotten corners of the Midwest, in towns where poverty builds walls taller than morality. She was not the first. She would not be the last. And yet, in her, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Every glance at her face, every slurred word, every forced smile beside her uncle was a reminder that the family's secret was no longer hidden in the dark. It was standing in plain daylight, wearing the mask of a marriage that never should have been. By the time she reached womanhood, whatever childhood she might have had was gone. Her uncle no longer pretended. The house no longer whispered. The silence hardened into something permanent, a script she was forced to follow. He would sit at the table and call her his wife in front of others, and no one corrected him. No one dared. She would lower her eyes, not out of respect, but out of survival, because defiance in that household never ended well. Her body bore the price of this arrangement. Pregnancies came early and often, each one heavier than the last. Some ended before they truly began. Some carried forward but left the children frail, marked in ways that mirrored her own struggles. The family explained these things away as misfortune, as bad luck, as God's will. But the truth was clearer than they wanted to admit. This was not misfortune. It was the echo of choices made generations earlier, now breaking through the flesh of their own descendants. Neighbors began to notice more than they ever admitted. Babies born too weak, children with faces that looked too similar, voices that never quite matched their age. But in a town like that, speaking out meant isolation, and so the community chose the easier sin, to look away, to pretend the family at the edge of town was merely strange, not cursed, to convince themselves that the word inbred was too cruel to use, even when everyone thought it. For her, love was never part of the story. What others knew as affection, she learned only as obedience. When she called him husband, the word clung to her tongue like rusted iron. She knew it wasn't right, some part of her must have known. But when every adult in your life nods along, when every voice around you insists it's normal, eventually you stop questioning, you surrender. The photographs from these years are the most haunting. A girl in a faded dress, standing beside a man twice her age, his arm heavy across her shoulders. She is neither smiling nor crying. She is something worse, empty. A hollow vessel caught between roles no human being should ever be forced to play. Daughter, niece, wife, mother, victim, each title overlapping the other until her name itself was lost. And this is where the story begins to take its darkest turn, because what happens when silence can no longer contain the weight of generations? What happens when the very children born of this arrangement begin to reveal the horror their parents tried so hard to hide?